Right, I'm going to make a start. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Global Cities webinar, which is being put on between the Westminster Property Association and New West End Company, our friends, the New West End Company. My name is Alexander Jan. I'm the rather grandiosely titled Chief Economic Advisor to WPA. I formerly worked at Arup and I'm also involved in the Central District Alliance, which is a business improvement district up the road from the New West End Company. Other business improvement in districts are available. And I'm joined today by Debbie Jackson and Rosemary Scanlon. Debbie is the Executive Director for Growth, Planning and Housing and the Built Environment at Westminster City Council, and she's been there since last year. Sounds like an enormous job you've got there, Debbie. She's responsible for a wide range of policy areas and delivery, and she has many years of experience in London government, both locally and at City Hall, and indeed north and south of the river, Clapham, Brixton, Lambeth, and as I mentioned at the GLA. And Rosemary Scanlon is an old friend of mine, I'd like to be able to say, or I shouldn't have put it those words, should I, Rosemary? But you know what I mean. Many years we've known each other through Tony Dravers of the LSE and Pat Brown, amongst others. And Rosemary is the emeritus chair of the Transit Centre, which is a US foundation that supports, informs, connects, and funds public leaders in the US and maybe Canada working to make transit better. And before her role with them, she was the divisional dean of the Schack Institute of Real Estate at New York University. Now, Rosemary has many years of experience as an academic and an economist. Much of it was gained with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, where she has many, many years of experience. She's also lived in London for a number of years and was the co-editor of the London-New York study in 2000, which we may touch on. And she's also written about the arts industry and other sectors which are very close to the heart of New York and indeed the West End more generally. So those are our two speakers for today. The purpose of today's webinar, as hopefully you will have surmised, is to really reflect upon the challenges that London and New York are facing in the wake or the continuing challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then also just to reflect on the way in which these two great cities are trying to respond to those challenges, some of which were, as we all know, kind of entrained before the pandemic hit in terms of changing behaviors around retail and indeed around work patterns. So that's kind of the purpose, and hopefully we'll get some insights and perspectives from both of our illustrious speakers on how these two city centres are tackling some of these challenges. As you know, well, if we could just turn now very quickly, I just want to give a few more numbers around how these two cities compare to help set the scene. And then I'm going to ask Debbie just to talk a little bit about what the City of Westminster is up to in its plans to tackle the problems I've mentioned. So, Katie, if you give me the next slide, please. So, pre-COVID, these numbers, some of which obviously won't have changed in terms of the administrative numbers, this slide just gives you a sense as to how comparable New York and London are. Often we draw comparisons between London and other major European cities, Amsterdam, Berlin, Frankfurt, Barcelona, and elsewhere. But in many ways, London and New York are the most congruent. In size terms, London is somewhat bigger in terms of its administrative city boundary. So the GLA area, as we might know it, within the M25 is around 600 square miles. And the similar area for the 5 boroughs of New York City is about half of that. But population-wise, the numbers are very similar. I mean, London is around 9 million. New York City, they pack them in a bit more over there, 8.4 million. But in city region terms, very similar at around 24 million. And by city region, I guess what we really mean is the economic footprint of these cities. Where do people commute in from? How far is the economic influence of the centers of these cities in a geographical context? And then again, pre-COVID, the unemployment rate, these are Q4 2019 figures, very similar, around 4%. I think slightly higher than the national averages, which is not unusual for cities where people are looking for work and there's a degree of churn in the labour market. And in terms of what economists call labour force participation, that's people who are either employed or looking for work, want to work. Numbers are not that dissimilar, again, at sort of 79 and 71%. Now, in economic terms, I've got this slide. It's not actually 1.1 billion, it's 1.1 trillion for New York, and it's about $619 billion for Greater London. So a Mars bar to anybody who spotted that error. So the New York economy is bigger in many ways, but subway ridership is comparable, 1.5 billion on the tube in 2019, pre-COVID, on an MTA rail services around 1.7 billion. And in international visitor terms, London somewhat ahead, but of course, New York has a much bigger domestic tourism market, which means these numbers are probably overall closer than just the international visitor numbers suggest. So that's kind of a pre-COVID snapshot. Now, if we look at what's happened since the pandemic hit, Katie, on the next slide, please. What you can see here is where some of those similarities are starting to drift apart, interestingly. So in terms of the impact of COVID, in terms of its health impact, if you measure that in terms of the number of deaths and therefore the death rates, given how comparable the populations of these cities are, New York's death rate is about twice that of London. The decline in economic output has been less, although we are comparing slightly different measures here, which we don't need to go into now, but London's seen about a 10% decline in its output in 2020 versus 6% for New York City. And the unemployment rate, interestingly, in New York has gone up to a much higher level than that compared to London, nearly 12.5%, place 7%. And on subway ridership, what we've seen here is, although both cities have seen a big decline, New York subway seems to be being used by more people. It's around at 50% of pre-COVID ridership levels, maybe a little less than that. But London's is way down at sort of 300 million. So around, on average for 2020, early 21, it's about a third of the total. And finally, both cities have seen a collapse in international visitor numbers, which of course has been driven by prescription on who can travel, when they can travel, and the ease of travel. So those are just a few facts and figures to help paint the picture for our speakers before we dive into those things today. And I know Rosemary's going to come back and comment on some of those New York numbers, probably find all my mistakes in them in a few minutes after Debbie's spoken. But Debbie, if I may, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the Westminster Property Association for hosting this and for having me today. I've been really looking forward to it, actually, because I think, it was always true that we should think about other perspectives and look beyond our shores, if you will. But it's more true than ever now, isn't it? So really grateful for the opportunity to be here today. I'm delighted to follow Alex's numbers, because if there's one thing that I will never be good at, it's the stats. I really admire those people who have the stats in their head, but I think I'm flanked by two people who will do a much better job of that than I will. What I'll do, I'm going to try and stick to my 10 minutes, is I'm just going to talk a little bit about the sort of view from Westminster, if you will, in terms of how we've responded, our role, which is quite an interesting point, how we've responded, and some thoughts about the longer term future of in particular, the economy and the sort of central London vibrancy, if you will. So I'll try and keep an eye on time and make sure I save plenty of time for discussion, and I really want to hear from Rosemary as well. So just a bit of context then, looking at those numbers, which were fascinating. I'm speaking from the perspective of Westminster here, although as Alex said, I did work for the Greater London Authority beforehand, so was sort of London-wide purview. And so a lot of the focus of what I'm going to talk about today, though, is going to be very sort of West End centric in terms of the sort of, you know, the picture postcard, the things that London is known for, arguably. And in that sense, I think there is one stat I managed to hold in my head, well, two, which is that Westminster, we've got about 25,000 residents 250,000 residents in Westminster. I see Alex's face, like, surely that's not right. But before the pandemic, we welcomed around 1 million people into the borough every day. So it's got that characteristic of sort of the super centre of world cities, where you have this flow in, which obviously as a local authority presents us with particular challenges and opportunities as well. Pre-pandemic, flourishing economy, everything was going great guns, you know, really successful city. Although we've already noted there were some pre-existing trends, and I'm sure we'll talk about that today. And with the most obvious sort of top of that list being retail restructuring, which it has impacted us, and I'll come back to that. What we do know from the statistics and the analysis, and this is certainly true of the UK, is that if you look at footfall and if you look at spend, the city centres that rely definitely on workers, and in the case of London, on visitors and tourists, have suffered more proportionally in terms of footfall and therefore spend and therefore their economies. So the absence of workers, and in the case of London, the tourists, has really hit the city. And what we do know is that we won't bounce back to where we were before. It's not just a question of biding our time, because there has been this acceleration of pre-existing trends. So retail restructuring being the top of that, you know, Debenhams is never coming back, nor is Topshop on Oxford Street. These iconic sort of building blocks of our retail landscape are not coming back, and nor will another department store come in to take Debenhams. So it's going to be rethought. But also we've got behavioural changes, and let's see where that lands. But it seems inevitable that worker behaviour is never going to be the same as it was before, and therefore employer behaviour will also change. But also tourist behaviour. I mean, you know, let's not forget, in the meantime we've had Brexit as well. So my lights have just gone out. But tourist behaviour. Lots of people have done a lot of thinking. Will we see a bit of a sort of a tide against international tourism as people have more of a sort of environmental and social conscience in terms of their impact? Let's see. Nobody knows where this is going to land. And we've had particular impact on some West End sectors because of the point I was making before about the impact on the cities. So some of those sectors where we have a particularly high prevalence, so retail and hospitality, lots of young people employed. So we're seeing unemployment rates amongst young people particularly high because those sectors have been hit. I said I'd say a couple of words about the role of the council, and I joined Westminster Council about a year ago. And I find it really interesting how the role of the local authority has changed over the course of the pandemic, because our democratic accountability is to our residents. That's the role of a local authority. But you can't escape in Westminster that we are a host borough for this extraordinary economy. And I think one of the things that has the council, you know, has done, which is really positive, is it's really stepped up to that responsibility. So we have an overarching priority vision, if you will, called City for All, that pre-pandemic had 3 pillars: smart, green, or this vibrant communities. And now we have a fourth pillar, which is about the thriving economy. So we have really stepped up and accepted and taking responsibility for the economy, because if the economy fails, we all fail and we all suffer. So, so it's really interesting how the role of the council has evolved through this process. So for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about, my organising principle is going to be survive, revive, thrive. Now, to be clear, this is my own thing. It's not a Westminster brand, but it helps me to organise my brain in terms of how the council has responded over the course of the pandemic. So if we think in terms of survive, this is really where we were last year, reeling from the shock of lockdown. No one could quite believe it. All of the businesses suddenly shut down. And what we had to do very quickly was mobilise to distribute business grants, dramatically scale up our crisis support for businesses. We had, businesses on the phone, genuinely not knowing how they were going to feed their kids and how they could access support. We created space on our streets. We threw out of the window all of our previous sensibilities about everything needing to be beautiful and planned and consulted, and all of that went out the window. Bollards went out, space got created. And then when businesses were allowed to open, but only outdoors, we introduced outdoor hospitality, and it sounds like that might be something we come back to. We also did a lot of talking to businesses and did what we could to represent their interests to government as well, in terms of policies that obviously emerged very quickly over the course of the pandemic. We'll just dwell on outdoor hospitality for a minute, because it has been a really key feature of the city and a very welcome feature of the city for many people. It's something that was born of necessity, but it's introduced a new and for many, let me put it that way, a much loved angle to our city, but it's not without its challenges. Some local residents have struggled with the noise, we've had accessibility issues, and there's antisocial behaviour issues. And we've worked really hard to try and adapt the scheme as we go and achieve that holy grail of my trade, which is balance. And we're still working on it, and we won't get it right all the time, but we're still working on it. And I think that's the key learning for me, is the importance of testing and trialing. I think in government can be very guilty of needing to completely prove and have a plan for something and tie it up with a nice bow before cracking on. And I think what we've learned through the pandemic is actually sometimes it's better to have a go, be prepared to accept it might not be right. In fact, it probably won't. Change it, develop it, respond. And I think that's a really healthy learning from the pandemic. Right, I said I would take 10 minutes. I need to speed up. Revive then. So revive is as the city reopens. And obviously we've been in this revive space a few times, because we've been a bit backwards forwards at times in terms of the unlocking. So our challenge in front of us now is, how do we entice people back into the city? Lots of people haven't been on public transport for 18 months. Travelling back in seems very intimidating and very risky. So a lot of what we've been doing is about creating reasons to come in. So enticing people in. So under this banner, we've still got outdoor hospitality. It remains a feature throughout the summer. We've been working across our partnerships to develop animation strategy. That's not the public-facing brand, obviously, but this is very much about creating moments of surprise and delight, where the fabric of the city gets used in a surprising and different way, in order for people to rediscover and re-love the city. We have a programme of pop-ups. Pop-ups aren't new, they've been around for ages, but we have an opportunity, because of the vacancy rate in the city, to allow small, creative, entrepreneurial businesses and creative artists and things to be in, like, the West End on Piccadilly. This would never have been possible before. And we've got all of our work in Oxford Street District, which I will come back to. To finish off my survive, revive, thrive, let me just turn to thrive for a minute. So one of the things that can happen, and I'm sure we're more than familiar with this, all of us, is you enter firefighting mode and you spend all of your time being tactical and reacting. And it's really important that we have reacted. But we also acknowledge that we need to have an eye to the longer term consequences. You know, we need to start thinking now about where the city might land and what our responses might be. So we've developed a programme, West End Futures, and under this programme we've got 5 themes that we're working on. The first one is about making the case for the city. So we believe that there is still a role for the agglomeration that exists in the city, but we feel like that case needs to be made. And it's about more than the net return to the Treasury. It's about the jobs that are hosted here, the people that rely on the city. It's about the supply chains and the sort of broader economic benefits of the city as well. And there's more arguments besides. So that's why the other 4 themes, the first one is destination. So really understanding the destination quality of the West End and how that will evolve on a global stage. What do we want to be known for? What are we known for? And the comparison with New York is fascinating today. The second one is about work, changing work patterns. What's that going to mean for the estate, if you will, and what we might do to respond. Living, what's the role of living now and in the future? Is there an opportunity to grow residential in a way that supports the vitality of the city? There's very well rehearsed models in the north of the country about city centre living for young professionals. Can we do that here, or is the affordability challenge just too great? And then transport, moving into and around the city. And then I'm just going to end on Oxford Street District if I can. So our sort of flagship programme, if you like, is the Oxford Street District programme. So Oxford Street, Regent Street, very well known, but we've also got the neighbourhoods of Fitzrovia and Marylebone and Soho and Mayfair, all part of this sort of super West End bit of the city. And before the pandemic, we had a plan. We recognised it was underinvested in, and we had a plan. We've revisited that plan, and we've brought forward action to where it's needed, which is in 2021. So on Oxford Street, we've widened the pavements, we've put planters in, we've made it a much more pleasant and pedestrian friendly place to be. I think I might have some pictures coming in. And brilliant, awesome. And we have a plan on Oxford Circus to pedestrianise what I lovingly call the shoulders of Oxford Street. So this will create extraordinary plazas outside the sort of west and east flanks of Oxford Circus, and really reimagine that extraordinary space. We also have the Marble Arch Mound. So this goes back into my Revive category. Look at this. This is as if we planned it. But this goes back into my Revive category. So this is made of scaffolding with greening on it. And this is to entice people back into the city. It's a folly, it's extraordinary, it's unexpected, it's surprise and delight. But we think it's the right thing to do to get people to be curious and want to have a go and experience the city. There's a range of other interventions. The Oxford Street District programme has got longer term interventions in terms of greenways. This is outdoor hospitality, in terms of greenways, in terms of garden squares, and it's a partnership project as well. So we're working really closely with a range of partners. But I've gobbled up too much time already, so I might stop there. And of course, I'm really happy to unpack any of that further if it's at all helpful. Thanks. I'll hand back to Alex, I assume.
Debbie, that was great. A remarkable tour de force. And I think, not to put too fine a point on it, I think your arrival at Westminster, in the midst of, last year's crisis, and as one question's already coming up about how long is this really going to go on for, it was in some ways great timing because of your clear understanding and indeed passion for tackling some of these things that you've already talked about, and perhaps some commentators would say a sort of a final acceptance, if final isn't too strong a word, of Westminster acknowledging that remarkable role it plays on behalf of all Londoners, which, as you say, is can be set at times it can create tension with residents. And of course, one of the statistics which I didn't put on the 2 slides is the proportion of the local tax base that the London government, New York government get to retain, which we could argue creates an incentive, a mechanism to justify to residents why all this growth and activity is allowed to happen. And I think hopefully Tony Travers isn't on this call, but I think the New York level of retention is about 50% and London's is about 5%. So, you know, it's about 10 times what London councils get to retain in terms of their property tax base, something of that order. But Rosemary will no doubt put me right. So thank you, Debbie. That was fantastic. We will take questions and some comments after Rosemary has spoken, and we'll make sure there's time for that. But if I could hand over to Rosemary, who is very generously joining us from North America. And I mean, it's 10:30 in the morning, so she's probably had more coffee than I have at that time. But thank you very much for joining us. At least we tried not to make it 6:30 a.m., Rosemary. So let me hand over to you, if I may. We just need to take you off mute, Rosemary, somehow.
Phrase of 2020, you're on mute. Anyway, here we go. Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
So it is morning in America, and that accounts for all of the light I couldn't quite shut down behind me here. But it also, one of the points I think I want to start with and then end up with is that it's also morning in New York, right? For New York City, we think we are on the path to recovery. It may not land us where we were at the end of 2019, where we had completed a decade where New York City had gained about 1 million jobs, and our unemployment rate, as you said, was down to 3.94%. It was an extraordinary decade. But anyway, so let me try and give you a sense of where we are at the moment, mid-July, odds of July of 2021. Yesterday, one of the top real estate firms, analyst firms, Marcus and Millichap, gave a report with some interesting statistics. I'll do them quickly, but since you're on record, people will have them. And the point, making the point that not all, some of the large companies in New York, but also around the country, are pushing to have their employees come back full-time because the impact on retail and other shopping in the central business district has been so severe, right? But Marcus and Millichap says that's about 39% of the firms, big firms, that want their people back in the major cities. And this would be about true of New York. But there are some major exceptions to this. We know that some of the big tech firms like Apple and Google and Twitter have said they're going to be very flexible in having their people come back to the office. And so in the United States and in the New York area, so have major firms like Citigroup and Vanguard, very large employees, whereas JP Morgan, which is so headquartered in New York City, has been quite firm about telling its people to come back. So another statistic from this survey is that about 17% are hybrid. 17% of the firms in these major metropolitan areas are having a hybrid situation. 10% is all work from home. And another 20% of firms say they're basically leaving their decision to employees. Now, a very good friend of mine who is a senior analyst executive with a major international firm, she was called back to work for 5 days a week in June, right? Come back to the office. She was not that happy about commuting back again from Hoboken, New Jersey, across the ferry, et cetera, et cetera. And she said the company is luring everybody back, including the middle management and the junior management people, by offering them cash payments of anywhere between $75 and $100 a day. They can use that money for travel, for breakfast or dinner, or when they get home, even though the company has a policy of providing food, as my friend Joan says, all day long, and with ice cream on Fridays. So lots of luring to get them back, although they've apparently relaxed a little bit for July and August and said, okay, you only have to come in 3 out of 5 days a week. And I think the statistic that's shaking out at the moment for New York City return to office in the central business districts is about 30% back, right? That's about it. And a lot of concern from the big landowners about the impact that that is having on midtown restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. Now, an interesting thing is happening in the boroughs, right? I live in Brooklyn Heights, which is just at the edge, south of the Brooklyn Bridge, and with very interesting neighborhoods, Carroll Gardens, Cobble Hill, et cetera, Gorham Hill. What we're noticing through the recovery is that the neighborhoods are showing strong recovery. Right? Retail is, I have to differentiate between restaurants and retail shops, which took a severe hit across the city's central city neighborhoods a good 3-4 years before the pandemic. And part of that was a case where retail rents had soared from, say, 2010 to 12, up to about 2015, just soared, went up like that. And a good old case of supply and demand, people couldn't afford the rents and even some of the great big international retailers who had moved into places like Bleecker Street and around the meat market district in Manhattan, they just closed up shop because the rents had gotten totally out of hand. Now it's considered the fact, now rents have dropped ever since 2016, they've been dropping steadily. And the possibility now that landlords will be more willing to negotiate with aspiring young shopkeepers is a kind of a hopeful sign now. But retail, as I said, was devastated well before the pandemic. But in the neighborhoods, what I'm noticing, not so much mine, in Brooklyn Heights, because I think a lot of people who live in Brooklyn Heights fled to the Hamptons or the Berkshires, right, for the pandemic. But further down in Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens, I'm noticing now as I walk down 20-25 blocks that local retail is reviving, not just restaurants, but the storefronts, small storefronts. And that's because I think of the people who were working from home in those neighborhoods. Right? And so I think to a large degree, the future, and I'm hearing the same thing, by the way, from parts of Queens and other parts of Brooklyn about the neighborhoods. So it's kind of similar to what the mayor of Paris has been talking about, the 15-minute city. People are either working from home or finding small WeWork type of spaces, right, for an office away from home, eating in the local delis and local restaurants, and shopping for toys or children's clothes, etc., sneakers. So that is a very, very hopeful sign. One of the also hopeful, and I would tell you that this past weekend, your great Financial Times weekend edition had 3 big articles on New York City. One was a love letter from one of their writers, picking up on a full-page ad that the big department store Bergdorf Goodman, once they reopened, placed in the New York Times that said, write us a love letter. This whole page ad is our love letter to New York City. We're back, write us a love letter. So this is what this writer wrote. And then another big article, again, this is the Financial Times, was Summer in the City, which focused on New Yorkers rediscovering their city. Back in the restaurants, the parks are filled, right, throughout the city. And the restaurants are packed, right? We can come back to Debbie and I'll talk to you about the al fresco dining in New York City. But the restaurants are packed. And my daughter, who's visiting from Portland, Oregon, made a couple of comments. Portland had some severe lockdowns, maybe not as bad as New York's at the peak, but she couldn't get over how open suddenly New York was and New Yorkers. We can now walk on the streets without a mask. Well, most of us have it on our chins down here, right? But we wear masks to go into a store or into a restaurant to go into it. We wear masks to go into the subway or a bus, what have you. And she also visited Boston and noticed the same thing. People careful, they could walk on the streets without their masks, but really dutiful about putting them on when they went in. But she also said that the restaurants in Boston were packed. They had a hard time finding, squeezing in. They'd have to go at 5 o'clock or something like that for dinner. The third big article in the Financial Times, which really relates to what we're talking about and what Debbie is talking about in the future of our central cities, was a revisiting of Jane Jacobs, the great writer of the Death and Life of American Cities, which I think was 60 years ago that book came out. And they're making the point, noting Jane Jacobs' emphasis on the importance of live, work, retail, right in the center of cities, which gives the cities their focus and their dynamism and their success, right? Whereas the blocks of office buildings, such as were put up in the 60s and 70s, say along 6th Avenue in New York, or one aspect cited in the article, Dallas, Texas, where the central city was all these tall glass box office buildings. City life was dead, right? So so that was a good point. And then that was on the weekend. And then on Monday, which was July 12th, the New York Times had a major article focusing on the construction of offices in CBDs, right? And they used about 20 or 25 around the country. And they used CoStar's real estate, the footprint of offices. And in a city like Boston's CBD, offices took up 85% of the downtown. In San Francisco, it was 74%. In Washington, D.C., 72%. Chicago, 68%. This is in the CBD. In New York City, where they defined the CBD, Central Business District, from 59th Street down to the Battery, it was 49%. So, certainly not as dense in the CBD as other cities. And the lowest on the comparison was San Diego, which in their CBD was 19% offices.
Okay.
So again, we're all going to be back now, Debbie and Alex, rereading our Jane Jacobs all over.
Sure.
Anyway, that's really an important point. Let's talk just a little bit about the restaurants.
And also, Rosemary, if you could also touch on the Times Square story,
yes.
as that might relate to Oxford Circus, that would be great. Yeah, I think, Katie, you could put those slides up, if that's all right, because I do want to leave time, I don't want to interrupt you, but I also want to leave time for some comment, if I may. I am sorry.
Okay, so no, that's fine. So Alex, Alex found these slides. These are before, and this is before they shut down the traffic in a lot of Times Square. So, and this was all done during the Bloomberg administration. And whereas the chart on the right is the pedestrianization of Times Square, which has been really successful. Although my friend and Pat Brown's friend, Tim Tompkins, who ran the Times Square Alliance, said those pedestrian squares got filled up with costumed characters, right? Spider-Man and Elmo. And they took a census one Saturday night and counted, I think, 57 Elmos between 51st Street and 42nd Street. Anyway, so that became a problem for a little bit. So Alex, go on to the next.
Yeah, Katie, we have costume characters running the country, I think, sometimes. But anyway, let's not get political. Right, this is the next one.
All right, and this was Times Square. This is your slide again.
Yeah, so we go to the next one,
okay.
Katie.
So the next one, these were taken on Tuesday of this week by my good friend, a young lawyer named Michael Riley, who's also a great photographer. And so I think these were taken at about 6 to 7 in the evening. So there are some people back, and I don't see any costume characters. Next slide, Katie, please. This is Grand Central Terminal, beautiful Grand Central Terminal. This picture was taken, I think, at about 8:30 on Monday morning. which would
Wow.
normally, now it's also Monday in the summertime.
Okay.
But so people would take long weekends, etc. This is a little bit later. This is in the evening or in the late afternoon. So people are coming back. There's some bicycle riders, right? They're probably waiting to get on one of the commuter trains to take their bicycles. And was there a third one, Katie?
I
Maybe
think
not.
I think
No, I
we're
think
done.
that was
We're
it.
done. Yeah.
Okay. Just a couple of points as I've
Yeah, for sure.
before. A little bit about the al fresco dining. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had the 2 months of really severe lockdowns, March and April, probably into May, of New York City. And when the city came up with the idea that we could perhaps do al fresco dining, Polly Trottenberger was then the head of the Commissioner for Transportation for New York City, and now is the Deputy Commissioner for Biden in the federal administration. Polly was quoted as saying, she said, usually it took the Department of Transportation 6 months to approve one permit for sidewalk dining. And last weekend, we approved 4,000.
Wow. Wow.
It's a wonderful statistic. So, and they just flourished all over the city. My neighborhood, my Henry Street's become its own restaurant row. So is Atlantic Avenue. It's really brave. And even in the wintertime, some of the restaurateurs scrambling to get the heat lamps, right?
Sure.
There's a great shortage around of heat lamps, but it's worked really well. And New Yorkers are, as we've said at the beginning, are just flooding the restaurants as they are the parks and out, supporting them. And Alex, you mentioned one article you saw where there's some grumbling on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. I said, well, I don't like these. But as my sarcastic comment was, those were the people that fled to the Hamptons during the pandemic.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Right. I'll be castigated in New York for that comment. But nonetheless, I think the general feeling is we want this to stay. Right?
Okay. Fantastic. Rosemary, I'm going to stop you there, if I may, because as I say, I wanted to leave a little bit of time. We've had a couple of questions coming in, and if anyone else has any, they can enter them to the Q&A. Look, I think there's some very interesting themes that have come out from both perspectives, from Debbie and Rosemary. And one of them is the extent to which perhaps both or a government in both cities has had to respond differently to the way in which it would have either planned ahead in policy terms or indeed in a very day-to-day sense with things such as the alfresco dinings. We have the slightly more clumsy term streeteries in Camden. This is on the other side of the frontier with Westminster, which I can just see outside of my window. Streets are very clean over there too. So that's one thing that's come out, that sort of agility of the public sector, which it understandably sometimes struggles with because of the need for accountability and to consult and so forth. But if I could ask you both one question, and then we'll go to the Q&A. To what extent do you think that the new things that you've both identified and talked about, such as these thriving, slightly out of centre neighbourhoods, or the changes in which we're using the space that's been freed up, to what extent is that world compatible with many of the things that economists are worried that we are going to lose from a productivity and an output point of view? So you talked, Rosemary, about the office and other uses in these central areas. And as we know from the work that's been done on agglomeration by various academics at the LSE and Imperial, agglomeration has been around. Somebody's mentioned Crossrail 2 in the Q&A, but agglomeration was key to the business case for Crossrail. So this widening and deepening of labour markets to give employers access to more skills and greater numbers of people in skills, and indeed employees the opportunity to choose employers and so forth. So to what extent are these two worlds compatible? Debbie, do you want to go first, maybe, if you any thoughts on that, and then Rosemary, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I think and thank you, Rosemary. I enjoyed that enormously, and you know, it was almost as if we rehearsed some of the commonalities between the two cities there, but we didn't. So I really enjoyed that. The I mean, I think we're, you know, one of the reasons why we're putting so much effort into the revival of the economy and thinking about what the future state of the economy is because we feel it's essential for us to, you know, we believe in the city. That's the best way I can put it. It goes back to that point I was making about West End futures and the case for the city. We believe the case for the agglomeration at the same time as wholly accepting that we are in an evolving situation, and what's going to work in the future is not going to be the same as what's worked in the past. I think it's really interesting to hear Rosemary talk about restructuring of pricing and supply and demand, because I think that's an inevitability, and that will cause some pain because, you know, there's going to be people in that equation that will lose out as compared with the situation pre-pandemic. But from a city making perspective, it could actually bring in some creativity, some new entrants, some, you know, and sort of mix things up a little bit. And I think I worked for the GLA in the aftermath of the recession as a result of the banking crisis. And you saw so much creativity and innovation, as you know, never let a good crisis go to waste. And you saw so much creativity and innovation. So I think undoubtedly there is going to be some restructuring and some pain, but I think ultimately the reasons why the agglomeration existed before remain true after, but it's just supporting a journey to a different set of circumstances. Don't know if that answers your question. But...
No, I think it does, Debbie. I think I'm going to be very cheeky now and just ask you to respond to two of the questions in the chat, if I might, you know, just so people don't know this isn't rehearsed. But one is related to what you've just said. One question is from an anonymous attendee. What do you think all of this impact will be in terms of infrastructure development? So they've even dared to mention Crossrail 2, heaven forfend. So do you think when this all shakes out, what does this mean for the case for Crossrail 2 is one question. And then there's a slightly more specific question from Mark Disney, which is, I think, and you know, maybe you can get back to him, but he just asked if there's a figure for the number of outdoor seats added across Westminster over the last year. Do you have any thoughts on both of those? And then Rosemary, I'll come to you right away.
Okay, so taking those in reverse, in 8 minutes, I've got a meeting about outdoor hospitality. So I'm just going to message the people and get them to give me some killer stats, because there are some awesome stats about the number of covers we've supported. So it
must be in the thousands. I mean, yeah, unscientifically walking around Soho as I do occasionally, it must be in the thousands. Okay.
So watch this space. I'll get back to you on that one. Right, and I think the infrastructure question is really interesting. So I think the question is slightly different to how you framed it then. Alex, because I think the question is, what impact do I think the infrastructure development will have, setting aside the Crossrail 2 question and whether that will ever happen. Of course, what I failed to mention is that the Elizabeth line is opening, let's see, we hope this year, but latest next year.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah, and what that does is it massively increases our catchment, because it makes it quicker to get to the centre of London for many, many more people. So we spend a lot of time talking about audiences. It increases our audience, particularly at a time when people's tolerance for difficult, long travel will be down. So I think it's hugely important. Alex, I think you asked about what's the likely case for future infrastructure development in cities. There's a whole leveling up conversation, which is a whole other seminar, isn't it? But I think so. I think I'll save that for another seminar. But I think at the moment, we're very excited about the opening of the Elizabeth line, and very pleased that is, that's so late in the process that it's definitely going to happen.
Fantastic. I mean, as Charles knows, I keep saying to anyone who'll listen, what are we going to do with Crossrail when it opens? It's massive increase in capacity built on the case for agglomeration, and you kind of get met with stunned silence from quite a lot of people when you sort of mention that. But Rosemary, if you could pick up on any points you'd like to respond to, and I'm going to be very naughty and actually pass a question that's for me in your direction, which is my dodgy statistics on London's output. I was saying I thought it was about 2/3 of that of New York's. And question from Blythe Dunk is there a particular reason for this, and a structural reason, and might there be more alignment in the future? I mean, I always thought New York and London's output were broadly comparable. And when I looked at those statistics, I kind of had to check my numbers. And there might be an issue with the exchange rate I've used, because the pound is very low for the year that I took to look at. It was about $1.25. But any thoughts on that, and indeed the other points that we've been talking about, and Debbie's picked up, if that's okay, if that's not too much to throw at you?
Well, very quickly, I mean, one of the reasons why New York's economic output is so high is partly because some salaries in New York City are so high, particularly in the financial district. You know, where it would not be uncommon for the median salary, and that includes everybody in a firm, to be $400,000 or $500,000 a year. Okay,
so that's even higher than you'd say for City of London and Canary Wharf. Okay, that's right, very interesting. Okay, we're all moving to New York.
London. Right. Hello. Right. Okay. But let me make a couple of other comments quickly about New York, because post Labor Day, the thinking is that more people will be lured or forced back to their offices. So instead of 30%, maybe in the fall it'll get up closer to 50%. So that anchors more retail in New York City. But the biggest change after Labor Day is Broadway is reopening.
Right.
I mean, Bruce Springsteen opened a couple of weeks ago. He was the leader. But right after Labor Day, almost every big show is opening. So when that happens, we will get many more American visitors, right? Because it's always been a big draw for Americans. And maybe by that time we'll have Canadians coming in. They'll have opened the border. And that will have a significant impact on the Midtown hotels, which have suffered terribly. And one or two of the really giant ones are still not open at all, right? Smaller ones and fancier, higher end ones have opened. Anyway, so the hotel industry will pick up the restaurant industry in the Midtown, and what the equivalent to your West End will pick up. So students are going to be back in school. There'll be much more traffic on the roads. I think the MTA is hoping that more people will come back on the subways when all of this happens, right? But nothing close to full capacity, nothing. No, we're not talking 2019. But another feature, and I'll wrap up with this, is that there's a lot of construction in the boroughs, an enormous amount of housing construction. Every place I look around me in Brooklyn, there's construction. And I hear the same thing in the neighborhoods in Queens. So there's more housing going in, and which also supply and demand is going to bring down some of the high prices of 2019, right? There'll be more negotiations. And that makes the city of New York, broad speaking, the five boroughs, more attractive to young people coming in, a very point that Debbie made before on one of her comments. Right? So there are some hopeful things.
Okay, great. Well, listen, I want to say thank you to you both. Debbie's got to rush off to another meeting now. Rosemary, we can give you your morning back and 3 minutes of the hour, hopefully. So thank you both really for a real tour de force of a whole range of very complicated issues affecting two amazing cities. It's about 30 years since the first work was done on London World City, and 21 years since the London-New York comparisons that were drawn. Rosemary and Pat and others, Tony Travers and Steve Glaister and others helped to put together. So I'm going to talk to Charles about whether or not we could, if not remake, maybe we could find a way of reheating some of that analysis and updating it, because I think it's something which is of tremendous use to policymakers and to investors and to property owners and those trying to make, work to make both of our great cities better. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much again. Thank you to all our audience and for your questions, to Katie and my colleagues who've helped pull this together behind the scenes. And for once in my life, I'm going to end on time, probably because I'm not doing the speaking. So thank you again. I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
And have a great rest
Lovely
of the day.
to meet you, Debbie. And thank you, Alex, and my pleasure to join you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay, fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.